Good afternoon, everyone. Just waiting for a couple more people to join here. Got quite a few people joining the meeting at the moment, so just thanks for your patience. Let's give another 30 seconds. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Satori's webinar on modern slavery reporting requirements. I'd like to introduce our expert today, Julian Hunn.
Hi, Troy, how are you?
Yeah, Julian, how are you going? Just in case you don't know, I'm Troy Nicholson, and I'll help moderate today's session. And for those of you who don't know me, haven't met me before, I'm one of the founders of the Satori Group, and I'm currently responsible for business development and account management activities at Satori Group. I'd like to introduce Julian Hunn from FCC Solutions. Julian has over 20 years of financial crime experience gained from working in Australia, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Julian's focus is on financial crime strategy and operations, and has held various senior compliance roles at HSBC, Merrill Lynch, Standard Chartered Bank, Jefferies International, and Westpac. His most recent role before moving to be an independent consultant was as financial crimes manager at Flight Centre Travel Group based in Brisbane. And that's how I met Julian and had the opportunity to work with him when he was at Flight Centre. Julian holds an MBA from the University of Queensland and a criminal justice degree from Griffith University, along with numerous other qualifications. Julian is currently on the board of the GRCI Institute in Australia and is heavily involved with ACAMS in the Asia Pacific region. And for those of you who haven't heard of the acronym ACAMS, it stands for Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists. So for today's session, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and we'll try and answer them as we go throughout the webinar. And if we have time at the end of the webinar to take questions, we'll be happy to answer them then. Also, we'll be providing and sending out a copy of the slides after the presentations as a reference guide. So without further ado, welcome, Julian. Over to you.
Thank you, Troy. Thank you, everybody, for joining this afternoon's webinar. As Troy mentioned, really the purpose of this presentation is just to give you a flavour around the modern slavery requirements. In Australia, the law was passed last year, so it's been out now for about probably 14, 15 months. In terms of writing a statement. So this presentation will cover probably 3 or 4 different aspects. It'll be talking about the practical steps to ensure compliance. It'll be probably highlighting some concerns that I've seen over in the UK. As many of you know, the UK has recently implemented a similar piece of legislation. And that legislation has been closely monitored in terms of the effectiveness via NGOs and various other key stakeholders. And essentially what they found in the UK is about 50 to 60% non-compliance with many of those statements. And when I refer to the UK, I'm referring to the FTSE 100. So the 100 companies in the UK, around 50% of those have found to be non-compliant. So obviously that's pretty serious. The key takeout really there is reputational damage. In terms of enforcement and penalties, they're quite minor at the moment. Certainly in Australia, we're not going to see monetary fines. But I think even more worrying is you probably will see reputational damage if you're found to be not complying, or certainly not even considering trying to comply with a piece of legislation. And look, this is human exploitation. So this is pretty damning area. And if you look at the Westpac investigation by Austrac over the last 6 or 12 months, we're talking up to $1 billion fine there. And a very small part of that Westpac fine and enforcement activity was related to child exploitation. So where I'm going with this particular point is human suffering, human exploitation is one area that the public society will not accept. So reputationally it can be extremely damning. And on the Westpac matter, there was probably 11 or 12 cases that involved potential child trafficking and exploitation, where actually that in the scheme of things was extremely insignificant, considering all the other areas of weaknesses and breaches that the bank was found to have not considered. So it's a reputational damage is really the focus. Okay, so the next slide is just highlighting the number of people in Australia that are deemed as being involved in, or certainly in terms of victims of modern slavery. And I actually think this number is pretty generous. I suspect it'll be much higher than this. This is obviously reported cases. So 4,300 is actually, in my eyes, very small. So I suspect it's probably 20, 25,000. Many cases obviously go unreported. And there's also a myth out there where people believe, slavery doesn't happen in Australia or the developed world, which is obviously a myth. There is definitely slavery going on in Australia. But really, where we need to focus our attention, and much of this presentation will be looking at the practical aspects of what you need to do to comply, which would be around risk assessments, monitoring, etc. It's probably fair to say too that looking at the UK experiences, much of the criticism been on the statements. The statements basically saying there's been very little substance to those statements. So you usually typically have a lawyer who will write a statement to comply with the Act, but essentially there'll be no substance to that statement. And what I mean by substance is, have you actually implemented controls or systems to obviously identify, measure, and control potential slavery acts, human exploitation through your respective chains. Okay, so what is modern slavery? So Australia's the first country in the world to actually try to define modern slavery. It's got numerous definitions and meanings around the world. The first bullet point here talks about coercion, threats, or deception. But look, I think the key point here is actually depriving them of their freedom. So when an employee or an agency has been deprived of their freedom, that could be deemed as being an aspect, or certainly a part of human slavery. So a good example of that would be in the Middle East. It's quite common for many organisations to take one's passport from them, which obviously restricts their freedom. That's actually a form of modern slavery. So the Act defines modern slavery as including 8 types of serious exploitation: trafficking, slavery, servitude, forced marriage, forced labour, debt bondage, deceptive recruiting for labour or services, and the worst forms of child labour. What's actually important here is that there's many different types of human exploitation, but it's important to note that the government and the legislation really covers serious exploitation. And these points that I've noted here in terms of that 8 types of exploitation are deemed as being serious exploitation according to the federal government. So what is the reporting requirement? It aims to support the Australian business community to identify and address their modern slavery risks and maintain responsible and transparent supply chains. This really all goes back to corporate social responsibility, transparency, being accountable, being good corporate citizens. And this is why reputation is absolutely paramount, because you're protecting the reputation of your organisation. Many will say, well, what about the share price? What about the monetary values? And if you look at the Westpac case, that share price dropped significantly as a result of the investigation by Austrac. And as I keep on saying, much of that investigation did not involve the human exploitation side, but unfortunately that's all you read in the papers. And that's what really made that case. So the public will not, and certainly condone any sort of human exploitation. And if you look at money laundering, terrorist financing, obviously it does get consumer and public awareness, but nothing such as exploiting children. So what is the reporting requirement in Australia? It covers large entities with over 100 million with an annual consolidated revenue must prepare these particular statements. Statements must explain what the reporting entity is doing to assess and address modern slavery risks. And this is probably the key of this presentation, is how are we as practitioners, how can we demonstrate to both the government, border control, and all the NGOs out there, demonstrate that we're actually effective and we're taking this seriously. The Act sets out 7 mandatory criteria, and I'll go through each one of those criteria one by one, but I'll focus my attention on 3. Now, the reason I'm focusing my attention on those particular 3 because they've been the areas in the UK that reporting entities have not complied with, or they've tried to comply with, but they have not done a particularly good job. 7, under the Act, the government has the power to publicly name entities that fail to comply with the reporting requirement. Again, this goes back to the whole reputation of the organisation. So once you finish your statement, you obviously have to send that on to Border Control. The Border Force, what they do is they then basically submit that statement into a database. And that database is accessible by all public and all the NGOs to see what you as an organisation is doing. And this is why there's so much information in the UK, because it's a very similar process. And the NGOs out there, the non-government organisations, are really the ones trying to establish who are being the good corporate citizens and who are being the poor corporate citizens. And obviously they do have a lot of clout, and they will use that against you if they believe that the organisation is not trying to comply with obviously the requirements. Now, I'll touch on this a couple of times in this presentation, but you'd be naive to think that you can abolish slavery through your supply chain in the short to medium term. That's not going to happen. And the expectation is for us to get to that stage, but you need to be realistic, and it's a slow process, and it's going to be certainly a timely exercise as well. So don't believe the onus is on you to eradicate and abolish modern slavery in your supply chain immediately. It's not as simple as that, but what's important is you can demonstrate to the key stakeholders out there that you've actually considered it, and you have controls and systems in place, or you're looking at developing controls and systems in place to obviously prevent slavery through your supply chains. As Troy mentioned, if there's any questions, please just send an email. I'm very, very open to obviously answering questions on the go. This presentation is wordy in some parts, and has been specifically designed that way because we do want this to be used as a reference tool. Much of this material has been directly pulled from the government guidance, so you can use this as a reference tool and certainly give you some aid in terms of helping you comply with the Act. On the left-hand side is the reporting periods. So you'll see there's 3 key reporting periods. The one that works on the Australian financial year, one that works on the calendar year, and the last one, and obviously I'm referring to the table on the left, works to it's UK or Japanese financial year. So these were the due dates for these statements, and you'll see the middle one in terms of the calendar year is 30 June next year, and the first one that's due is 1 April to 31 March 2020, which is due this September. However, it's important to note that there was a media release last week, or 2 weeks ago now, from the Assistant Minister of Customs, which is allowing a 3-month deadline extension. So essentially the way I've interpreted this extension is, if you go back to the table to the left, the Australian financial year allows you to report 3 months later, and the foreign financial year allows you to report 3 months later as well. So the middle one, you're still obliged to complete your statement by 30 June 2021. The top one's going to be obviously March, and the bottom one's going to be end of this year. So if you're working on the foreign financial year, you need to have the statement submitted by the end of this calendar year with that 3-month extension. Okay, so this is the modern slavery framework. I think most of you will be familiar with risk frameworks and how they operate and how they work. This is nothing new. It works on the general categories of design, assess, mitigate, remediate, monitor, review, and report. And certainly if I was helping, or if I was going to design a framework for a particular organisation, I'd be using this as probably the key framework on the front, probably on the front or second page. And then I'll be working along this framework in terms of what are you doing to comply with it. Designing is obviously designing the framework. The second part is assess, conduct due diligence on the modern slavery risk in the business supply chain. And that's probably going to be the most challenging for many of you. And I'll walk you through the best way to do that, depending on the size of the organisation. And then you obviously go to remediate, monitor, review, and report. Many of you won't be remediating in the short to medium term. And when I talk about remediate, I'm talking about you've identified some form of slavery in your supply chain, be it domestically or be it internationally. What are you doing to obviously to remediate that particular matter and improve it? And again, that is a requirement in the statement, which I'll touch on shortly. So what does the Act say I need to do? The Act requires you to prepare an annual statement covering your entity's reporting period. So obviously the annual statement and the reporting period we've covered. Your reporting period means a financial year or other annual accounting period, which we've covered. You will need to prepare a statement for every reporting entity for every reporting period for your entity. Going forward, you need to begin reporting on your first full reporting period after 1 Jan 2019. As I mentioned earlier, there is a 12-week extension on that now. And you will need to submit your statement to the Australian Border Force within 6 months after the end of your reporting period. So that statement must be in before the end of that particular point. So the 1st of January, basically, you need to have it in by 3 months after that period under the new guidelines. Okay, so now we're going to basically the crux of the presentation, which is really around the statement. I purposely designed this presentation not to talk about the legal formalities and talk about the theory. It's more around what do we need to do and how do we comply, because that's by far the most challenging aspect of it in terms of doing the legwork. I've seen many organisations here in Australia and overseas where they write a pretty good statement, but there's no substance to that statement. And that's exactly where the NGOs and the government will be testing you. It's all well and good saying, well, we do this and we're effective here and we're effective there and we're monitoring, etc. But how are you doing it? And can you demonstrate that there's some tangible measures in place that you've employed to show that you are indeed doing that? Which moves down to point 5, which I'll talk about effectiveness later. So identify the reporting entity. That's a nice easy one. Obviously, that's going to be your legal entity. Describe the reporting entity structure, operations, supply chains. Again, look, this is factual information. Interestingly, a lot of companies in the UK haven't complied with Part 2 particularly well. The reason being is they haven't gone into detail about their supply chains being domestic or international, and exactly what those products and services are within those supply chains. I've got some good examples coming up, some good practices that I've seen overseas. The 4th one is describe the actions taken by the reporting entity and any entities it owns or controls. So this essentially covers due diligence and remediation processes. Remediation I've touched on, but I will go into a little bit more detail. Due diligence is obviously doing due diligence on your supply chain, on your suppliers, 1st, 2nd and 3rd tier. The 5th one is probably the weakest point, or the weakest requirement I've seen globally. Organisations are not particularly good at doing this. And I'll provide some examples in terms of how you can demonstrate that you've complied with point 5 shortly. The sixth point is really just talking about the joint statement. Obviously, if you have a large number of subsidiaries or operations within your organisation, then you can provide one statement for all those respective entities. Some companies, for example, will have businesses in the UK. UK currently has an obligation to submit an annual statement. Obviously, you can combine the Australian and the UK one together on the condition you meet both requirements in both legal requirements. And as I mentioned earlier, both pieces of legislations are actually very similar. There's some nuances, but nothing material. And the 7th requirement in the Australian statement is providing other information. So this will be where you've worked with NGOs, where you've rolled out training for the industry, for etc. So previously at Fly Centre, we rolled out training for some other organisations involved in travel, and that's exactly where we would include or incorporate this information. So they're the 7 criteria. Sorry, Troy.
I've got a question just come in. Just says, from your experience, who should be responsible for this requirement in an organisation?
Look, that's a good question. And that's probably the key hurdle for most organisations, especially large organisations. Because what you'll have is a risk department, you have the legal department, you have the compliance department, the financial crime department, and it's very difficult to find an owner. From my experience, the legal owns it, and legal should own it, because obviously you're trying to meet a regulatory requirement. So legal should be basically drafting the statement. But in terms of complying with the details and the requirements within that statement, it really has to come down to the risk team or the operations. in terms of, the risk assessments, in terms of making sure there's appropriate due diligence. So at my time at Fly Centre, it was a legal requirement, obviously, but it was legal who wrote the statement. I just was in charge, or my team were in charge, to ensure the statement was being complied with around the due diligence and the operations of it. But that's probably my main hurdle. It becomes very siloed. You'll have 5 or 6 different departments depending on the size of the organisation, and each department has their own responsibility, but they're not talking. So it's very important that this piece of work is given it's a project. It's very important that a key stakeholder, and that key stakeholder should be very senior, should be the sponsor, and they should bring all the various departments together on a regular basis to ensure it's being run smoothly. Okay, the company statements under the UK Modern Slavery Act. So the reason I'm showing you this, because as I say, it's very similar to the Australian requirements. And it's been in the UK now since 2015. So there's enough runs on the board to really demonstrate how is UK performing, and how are the UK public companies performing, the private companies that meet their particular reporting requirement, which I believe is £35 million, their turnover. And what I've tried to do is consolidate a number of assessments, reviews, questionnaires from multiple NGOs, and try to score those to demonstrate exactly where these companies are falling down. And the 6 points on six points relate to the requirements in the UK, slightly different to Australia, where they've called out training, but essentially very similar. So the structured business supply chains, and this is out of 5. So the average score for the FTSE 100 companies, and when we say FTSE, we're talking very large organisations here in the world, Shell, BP, BAE, Aerospace, etc., sitting at 1.7 out of 5. So that's pretty poor. And how this has been assessed is by the NGOs reviewing the statement, that is the public statement, and seeing if they're actually meeting the requirements as per the legislation. And according to the first one, they got 1.7. The second one around policies in relation to slavery and human trafficking, 1.9. Due diligence process seems to have been slightly better with a scoring of 2.3. Risk assessment and management, 1.9 out of 5. This is one area I'd like to really dig into, because it's an area that I think a lot of organisations have problems with. Effectiveness is 0.8. Now, effectiveness is also a requirement here in Australia. And I will focus heavily on effectiveness, because you need to demonstrate to the key stakeholders out there that the framework or the regime you put in place appears to be effective. Now, it could be ineffective, but as long as you can demonstrate there's continuous improvement year on year. So maybe the first year you've only managed to train 2% of your supply chain. Next year's 3%. What you're clearly demonstrating here is you're being realistic and you're showing continuous improvement. And I'll talk about some good and bad tips later, but obviously don't make things up and don't be too ambitious. Make sure they're realistic in terms of what you're saying. So the effectiveness and the risk management is probably that's why I'll be focusing my attention the next half an hour. Okay, so the first requirement in Australia and also the UK is the structured business and supply chains. And all I've done here is the left-hand side of this slide is the Australian guidance in terms of the things that you should be looking out for across those 3 requirements: structure, operations, and supply chains. And look, it's pretty easy stuff and it's pretty factual. So explain the general structure of the entity. Is it a public company? Is it a partnership? What are your is it downstream? Who actually owns it? Do you have foreign subsidiaries? So this is pretty basic stuff. Operations just talks about what's your industry? What is your sector? Are you involved in mining, retail, manufacturing? Are you involved in lending? The third one is identifying the countries and regions of your supply chain. The first and second one, as I say, is very easy to meet, but the third one is where organisations find it difficult to really understand where those risks are. There's some pretty good examples out there, and really the expectation here for you is to say, okay, we have 15 suppliers, 10 suppliers are based in Australia, 5 suppliers are based overseas. These 5 suppliers are based in Japan, Indonesia, China, and South Africa. That's a good starting point. So this should not be a difficult requirement to meet. As I say, there's some good examples out there. There's some very poor examples. But if we go back to the previous slide, you'll see the average is 1.7 out of 5, and the highest score is 4. So clearly, this requirement is not being met, which is quite surprising. On the right-hand side, I pulled a section out from Kingfisher, which is obviously a UK company, and I've tried to demonstrate how they've covered this particular requirement in their statement. And it doesn't need to be too technical. It doesn't need to be too comprehensive. You don't need to over-engineer this particular section. It just needs to be sharp, succinct, straight to the point. So the business structure, it provides a good qualitative assessment, overview of the company in terms of people, in terms of customers, etc. And on the right-hand side, it goes a little bit more detail around the number of colleagues, the countries, etc. It'd be good to know where those countries are. So if I was going to be critical of this, I'd want to know what countries. Are they high-risk jurisdictions for slavery? And also the number of suppliers. But look, this is not a bad attempt. And the reason I've used this one, because I think this particular one got about 3 out of 5, 2.5 out of 5, but it just shows you how simple it can be. And this is just meeting the first requirement. The more challenging requirement, which many organisations have problem with, is really the risk assessment. And if you work for large organisations, you will have an enterprise risk team, or you have some sort of operational risk team that can do this for you. So as I mentioned earlier, legal will usually own the statement, but the actual operations of it and the legwork usually should be performed by someone who understands the business from a risk perspective. So that's very, very key. And one of the ways you need to start this is you need to understand, is your organisation causing slavery? Are you contributing to it? Are you directly linked to it? So the example I had at Fly Centre was, I know orphanage tourism. So orphanage tourism is obviously it's a form of modern slavery. Human exploitation is basically people up in it's usually organised crime groups. They'll set up an orphanage in, say, Thailand. They'll take those children away from their parents. They'll pay the parents a very little money, and they put these children into orphanages. And then Westerners will go up to Thailand or Indonesia, whatever, and will feel sorry for these children and will pay their money. That money is not going to the children, and it's really not going to the parents. It's going to organised crime activities and criminal activities. So essentially what they're doing is they're sucking Westerners in to obviously contribute and assist these sort of organisations. So what Fly Centre needs to do, and obviously what Fly Centre has done, is we've made it very clear in terms of tours. We do not associate ourselves, well, Fly Centre does not associate itself with orphanages that are not licensed and not obviously been approved by the government. And we also are also heavily involved in education and awareness. So that's a sort of remediation that I'll talk about later. So it's important you understand what your company does, its operations, and where you're exposed. So if you buy and sell electronics, or if you sell electronics in Australia, you're more than likely importing those electronics from China or Malaysia. Now, that's where the risk will be. Are any of your suppliers in those respective jurisdictions involved in some sort of slavery? So that's the sort of thinking process you need to have. Okay, so in order to do a risk assessment, obviously you need to know your business. So what are your products? What are your services? What are your countries you deal with? And look, let's keep this pretty simple. Point 1, identify the broad operations and overall supply chain structure of entity at a thematic overarching level. So if we look at the left-hand side, the diagram, these are the 5 largest imported products in Australia. Electronics, garments, fish, rice and cocoa. And this is directly from the Global Slavery Index. So straight away you can establish, is your business involved in any high-risk products or services? And these are the top 5. There's obviously many more other industries out there, but these are the top 5 imports. Point 2, check which of the sectors, types, products and services, categories of investments, countries and entities that you may have identified may involve high modern slavery risks. So as I mentioned earlier, and I think this is on the next slide, we know electronics is high-risk product. we know the manufacture of electronics is predominantly done in Malaysia and China. So therefore, you've already identified the high-risk products and you've identified the high-risk jurisdictions. And as a result of that, your risk assessment should follow that course. So you may have 20 countries where you have suppliers, but you only have 2 or 3 countries that are being deemed as high risk because of the involvement of the industry that they're involved in. In Australia, for example, and as I mentioned earlier, there is this myth that there's no slavery in Australia. You look at agriculture, construction, domestic work, meat processing, cleaning, hospitality, food services. These are obviously all very prevalent in Australia. So you will definitely see slavery and human exploitation in Australia. So when you do your risk assessment and you start to write your statement, just don't assume that slavery is an international. It's domestic as well.
Julian, I've just got another question that's come in from one of the attendees. They're saying their industry has numerous tiers of suppliers. So surely, how do they risk assess the entire operation?
It's very, very challenging. From my experience, most organisations will have probably 3 tiers. So again, I'll use a flight centre example. So you have flight centre arrange a package holiday to, say, Thailand. The primary tier 1 could be a hotel. Tier 2 could be, say, a tour company that works with a hotel, and tier 3 could be the bus driver of that tour company. Now, if that bus driver is being treated inhumanely, then obviously that's a slavery issue at that tier 3. So my recommendation is be realistic and focus on the tier 1s. So focus on your direct suppliers and then gradually work back over time back to your second tiers and third tiers, because essentially what you should be doing, you should be educating your first tiers. You should be putting requirements and obligations on your first tiers around questionnaires, and then putting the onus on those first tiers to ensure that the supply chain that they source from is indeed transparent and accountable as well. So very difficult. It's not realistic to do all the tiers in one hit. Start with the first tier and then work with your first tier suppliers to work gradually down. Because most of the tiers you're not going to have obviously any visibility from at all, especially when you look at, if you look at different sort of agriculture, or it goes through 3 or 4 different tiers. So it's impossible to try to combat that initially.
Okay, I've got just one other one, Julian, while we're here. I think it's topical. What would be an example of a potential direct link to modern slavery for an Australian bank?
On Australian bank. But this is an interesting one for Australian banks. And it's something that I've been focusing heavily on with ACAMS because banks will have customers, obviously. So from a bank perspective, banks will have customers and banks will have suppliers. So from a bank, one of my first priorities would be looking at the customers and ensuring that customers are considering, obviously, modern-day slavery measures and practices. Now, the reason I say that, because modern slavery is regarded as a crime in the criminal code. So therefore, if you're a bank or you're reporting into in the AML world, you fall within money laundering. So if you have a customer and your customer, so just say company XYZ imports electronics from Asia, they bring those imports into Australia. There is public information out there that suggests that the manufacture of those imports in Asia that you're sourcing from are involved in sweatshops and inhumane practices, and your banking company ABC here in Australia. Essentially, what you're doing is you're facilitating those transactions, both in and out, which essentially means you are facilitating those transactions, which brings you within the Money Laundering Act. And as a result of that, you probably you do have an obligation to make a suspicious transaction report. So a direct would be maybe there'd be 2 aspects to it. It could be direct from your supplier, so maybe you're supplying uniforms or furniture in your organisation that is being directly from a factory in China that's involved in this sort of activity. And the second aspect is through your customers. Are you directly facilitating transactions where your customer supplier is involved in modern day slavery acts? So it's an interesting one because many people just think this only impacts non-banks, but actually it impacts banks as well. And the focus should be twofold. It should be on the banking customers, and it should be on your suppliers. And when I refer to suppliers to banks, I'm talking obviously about, it could be uniforms, technology, it could be furniture. So when you do your risk assessment, you need to look at it from both angles. Fortunately, there is a level of reliance in Australia, because if you bank a reporting entity with a turnover of more than 100 million, then obviously they have a legal obligation to comply with that. So the risk is probably not going to be with your larger organisations or your customers. It's going to be with the smaller organisations that don't have to comply with it, which brings you back into twofold. It brings you into a money laundering issue. Also brings you into obviously a slavery reputational issue as well.
Julian, we've got quite a few more questions coming through, but I might save them to the end,
Okay.
just to make sure we get through the slides. And then if people are happy to stay on, I'm sure we'll be happy to answer more questions. But I'll just let you move through the slides for now.
Yeah, sure. Look, and they're very important questions, because these are the sort of questions that that many organisations find difficult to implement, or these sort of questions and answers, because it's the operational side of it. Very, very easy to meet the regulatory requirements by drafting a statement, but trying to meet the requirements of that statement is a different thing altogether. Okay, so I mentioned about import and export, and again, this is still on the same topic of risk assessments. So what I've tried to do is just quantify this in a little bit more detail. Now, this is a couple of years old, these slides, but it gives you a flavour. And this is what you need to show in the risk assessment, and this will help you defend. It's certainly defensible if you're challenged by an NGO or by the government. So we look at the left-hand side. We talked about electronics, garments, fish, rice, cocoa. So if you're involved in electronics, you have a high-risk product. If you import electronics from China or Malaysia, you've got high-risk jurisdictions. The same as garments. If you're importing garments from China or India, Vietnam, Thailand, fish, for example, as well, Thailand. So this gives you an idea of really where you should focus your attention: products, services, countries. Very similar to most risk assessments, be it financial crime, be it bribery, corruption, sanctions. It's exactly the same concept, the same theory applies. I appreciate you may have a number of customers in Malaysia, or you may import, or you may have 10 suppliers in China. The next variable to look at is what is their turnover, and what is their revenue to you and expenses to them. So you may have one organisation in China that's even though it's high risk because it's electronics and China based. Really, the actual turnover of that organisation and supply is so small it's kind of insignificant. I'm not saying there's no risk there, but I'm saying don't just factor in products and services. Factor in the revenue and turnover as well between you and the suppliers. That should form part of the risk assessment. Now, the right-hand slide really just looks at the demographics. Now, the reason I've highlighted the demographics because it's important for you to note how slavery and how human exploitation changes around the world. So the table on the right is specifically for Asia Pacific in 2015. Now, there's some interesting takeouts here. So you'll see the gender breakdown is 17% female, 83% male. It's actually, globally, it's around 60-70% female and 20% male. The reason the female is so low in Asia is because it's mainly men who are involved in this sort of a domestic work or fishing. Well, if you go to Eastern Europe and you go to the Middle East, you're seeing a very high percentage breakdown of females who are basically being, used for prostitution and trafficking around Europe. So it could be parts of Eastern Europe over to Western Europe. So it's important you understand your regions and understand exactly who you're dealing with. So the sector of exploitation we see is fishing. Now we know fishing is high risk because it's on the left-hand slide, and we know fishing, the sort of country we should be looking for should be Thailand, Indonesia, China, Taiwan. So if you're providing prawns, fish here in Australia, just say if you're Coles or Woolworths, then obviously this will help you understand your risk assessment. We know fish is high risk. We know men involved in fishing, and we know that these jurisdictions are where we should be focusing our attention. And fishing is really key because what actually happens is they put men out onto fishing trawlers and they just sail around the Pacific for literally months. They go into port, they dump the fish, they go back out again. They haven't got their passports, and basically there's a debt bondage, which means they're holding debt. Before they left, they gave their family money and they're going to pay that debt off for 5 or 10 years. So when you go to Coles and Woolworths, and if you look at the fishery area, you'll see it'll talk about clean sourcing. The lower one is talking about the types of exploitation and the mode of entry into trafficking. So you'll see it's 1,590 of offer employment or labour migration opportunities. Again, this comes down to the fishing and various other aspects as well. But if you move over to other parts of the world, other different regions, you'll see different levels of exposure according to the different modes of entry and the types of exploitation. So the point here is, don't just focus on products and services and jurisdictions, focus on the region and what are the typologies and demographics of that particular region. Okay, remediation due diligence. Due diligence is obviously the first step. So the due diligence refers to an ongoing management process to identify, prevent and mitigate and account for how the entity addresses actual and potential adverse human rights. So much of this is around the risk assessment. And we'll talk a little bit further around the risk assessment and the sort of things you can do for customers that are high, medium or low risk. The 4 key parts is pretty straightforward, so I'm just conscious of time. As I said earlier, this is all for a reference, so you can refer back to this at a later time. I'd rather focus more on the operational, practical things that we can talk through today. Remediation is really just, you've identified as part of your risk assessment, as part of your monitoring and questionnaires, you've identified a potential harm, within your supply chain to your customers or to your suppliers. The expectation from the UN and the expectation from the Australian legislation is you make good that bad, if indeed it is indeed directly linked to you. As I say, the example I used earlier, Fly Centre, I'm not saying it was directly linked to us, but obviously you're back to Fly Centre arranging tourism in parts of Asia, and then the tour operators were then going to orphanages. It was very important for Fly Centre to obviously educate customers and to ensure that there was no longer tours to these orphanages. So basically, try to make that good around removing that, removing those blacklisted orphanages, but also making customers very aware that when they leave the country. Okay, now we move down to effectiveness. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the key area within the statement that organisations are very, very poor at. I think the example I used there was 0.9. And keeping in mind the UK has been running for 3 or 4 years and they've still got a very poor output. And this is where the NGOs focus their attention. The effectiveness is basically saying how effective is your slavery framework. Establishing a process, regularly checking your risk assessment process, setting up process to provide regular engagement and feedback between your key areas of unity. Look, the key theme here is really around continuous improvement, because obviously this industry is extremely dynamic. It was the 4th or 5th largest organised crime criminal industry in the world only 3 or 4 years ago. It's now number 2. So it's growing substantially. And I suspect it's growing substantially because obviously as practitioners we're getting much better at identifying it. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot of this increase quite recently around the whole COVID as well. Conducting internal audits, monitoring, tracking the actions you have taken, working with suppliers to check how they are progressing, considering trends. So the example I used earlier around, men make up 20% at this point in time. Around Asia Pacific, that may increase, that may decrease. So I think it's males around 80%, females 20%. And work directly with NGOs. I've done a lot of work with NGOs. Firstly, it gives you a lot of kudos because it shows that you're being proactive. And secondly, these NGOs have done a lot of work. So there's a good source of information that you can drag and put into your frameworks. So these are 2 examples from the UK in terms of how they're demonstrating in their statement how effective they actually are. And one of the best ways to look at this is work with KPIs, because many organisations find it difficult to try to demonstrate a tangible value in terms of how they're being effective. So the sort of things I'd be looking at would be how many questionnaires have you sent out to suppliers? If you have 100 suppliers, you send out 10 questionnaires, that's obviously you're sitting at a 10%. You send out another 5, or say next year you send out 15. That's showing a continuous improvement and you're actually quantifying your performance. Now, for the first year, you're not going to get 100%. It depends on what you're actually doing. You may do and you may not. Training, for example, is another great measure or control that you can demonstrate to NGOs and senior management where you've committed and you're making progress. So to train all your employees, I would like to think, depending on the size of the organisation, if you have an online training tool, should be relatively straightforward. That's a KPI of 100%. The next step is to then train your suppliers if that's necessary. Another good KPI is terms and conditions. Have you updated your supplier agreements to incorporate terms and conditions around slavery? That's a relatively easy do, and it's very easy to show the effectiveness around that. Screening. If you have a supply base of 1,000 and you've identified 100 high-risk suppliers, then should you screen those suppliers against adverse media to see if company XYZ has been involved in the media attention in that particular country or globally? Again, a great KPI and demonstrates to all the key stakeholders that you're taking it seriously. So there's many different ways you can use this, these key performance indicators to demonstrate that you're taking this seriously in what you're doing. And there's some good and bad takeouts here as well. I mean, it doesn't have to be positive. Everything's positive, I would actually be suspicious. If you're sitting 100% for everything, then you've done a fantastic job, but you may actually get NGO attention. Okay, so these are the key findings from the UK. Explain the risk. So some companies have explained the risk identified in their supply chain, including where the risk was identified. So I talked about the products, the services, the countries. That's a good thing. Raised awareness among their suppliers of modern slavery risks. Liaise with your suppliers. Put the onus on your suppliers. I'm seeing a lot more questionnaires come to me now from banks and other organisations asking us to complete a questionnaire. Review existing policies and practices. This is a very dynamic environment. Ensure your policies and practices and risk assessments are updated regularly. These are good practices. Some poor practices. 50 companies provided no information on whether their actions were effective. So 50 companies out of 100. Extremely poor. 28 companies did not explicitly say they were approved by the board or equivalent. This is a similar requirement in Australia. So you're really going to hang yourself out to dry there if you haven't clearly articulated in your statement that the board of directors or the CEO or the audit committee have signed off on the statement. A very simple exercise and one that clearly shows that there's accountability, transparency, and there's top-down buy-in from the organisation. Not a difficult task to meet, but you'll see nearly 1 in 3 in the UK have failed that particular point. Conscious of time. So what are the key tips in terms of writing a statement? And these are the key tips I pulled out from the UK and also liaising with various other clients, both in Australia and overseas. Engage senior management. Ensure they understand the statement process. This is basically just a heads up to senior management and the board. It's just to let them know what their obligations and what their requirements are. You'll see Westpac, the CEO and the chairman both step down because of the AML matters. As I keep on saying, the AML matters did not necessarily relate to breaches or weaknesses to do with infrastructure or anything else. Well, it did actually, but the reason they got such poor reputational damage from that was because of the child exploitation. It was not because of the failings in their transactional monitoring systems. That was identified as obviously a weakness in the regulator, but the media jumped on the child exploitation, and that's why they stepped down, because of the poor media attention. Involve relevant areas of your entity and entities your entity owns or controls. And I touched on this earlier around silos. Do not work in a silo mentality. If you're a large organisation, you've got compliance, legal risk, financial crime, come together, identify a key stakeholder who can support the program, and make sure that person oversees that program to run smoothly. Otherwise, it will turn into an absolute mess. So there needs to be an owner. Avoid copying generic templates. I suspect there are a number of organisations out there copying a good template from a different organisation, just putting their name in there. The NGOs will pick up on this, the government will pick up on this as well. And it just clearly demonstrates that you haven't taken it seriously and you will be a target. And look, point 4 is really key. Be honest about your entity situation and risks and what you have done to improve. As I mentioned earlier, you'd be naive to think that there's no risk in your supply chain. Accept it. Highlight what you're going to do about it. That's going to give you it's going to give you more credibility than saying there's nothing in your supply chain. It's all clean. because then the NGOs will focus their attention on you. Consider what next steps will be and how you show improving your next statement. And this is around the continuous improvement. So if you've done 10% training this year, then you'll target next year 15%. And this is a key KPI. The NGOs, the governments want to see improvement year on year. Avoid aspirational statements that are not supported by action. So I've seen some statements, people just come out and they read so well, and they've done this and done that, but there's really no substance to it. And many of these statements that I've seen and read, especially in the UK, the statements read well, but there's no substance whatsoever. You start asking, well, how do you monitor? They have no idea how they monitor, but it just reads well and looks good in their statement. And consider how you can benefit from third-party expertise and partnerships. So even ringing up an NGO and asking for some information or getting them along to do training to train your business, that looks good. It obviously helps with the training exercise, and that should form part of your statement, which I mentioned earlier. I think it's requirement 7 or requirement 8 in terms of what other areas or what other measures have you applied. So what are the key takeaways? And much of this I've covered already. Focus on substance and not tick box. Provide detailed information on risk assessment. The risk assessment and the KPIs for effectiveness, which is the next one, by far the most important parts of your statement. If you've performed an effective risk assessment, you should know exactly where to focus your attention. You should know exactly where to focus your resources, and you should then be able to build KPIs to demonstrate that you've actually met a level of effectiveness. And again, this is not rocket science. There's copious amounts of information out there that you can use in the public domain to help you. Ensure a continuous improvement approach. This is ongoing. This is obviously dynamic. Things change daily. Collaborate with NGOs. I've covered that. Reputation. Don't be named and shamed, and that's exactly the risk. So some of the hurdles that many of you will encounter when you approach the board or you seek resources around this as well. This is not really that important. It's just another one of those requirements. For me, it is significantly, it's a significant risk because you will be named and shamed. And that will have a significant detriment to your share price if you're listed, to your directors, etc. And the media will jump on that. And really the key takeaway here, and just be realistic in terms of what we're trying to achieve, you're not going to abolish slavery overnight. It's not going to happen. And I've had many questions around this, well, how are we going to stop it? What are we going to do about it? You're not going to get rid of it overnight. You may come across a first-tier supplier that you've identified that's involved in, maybe exploiting men in a particular role or task. Possibly one of the worst things you can do is de-risk them and actually exit that relationship. Because what you're doing is you're putting them in a position where they have no work. What the government expects you to do, and what a lot of other NGOs expect you to do, is to work with your supply and help your supply grow, become more transparent, become more accountable. If clearly they're not going to fall into line and work with you, that's exactly when you should be exiting. But just think about the implications. If you do exit immediately because you panic, you could potentially be leaving that supplier and all those employees with that supplier basically without work in an emerging market, which is going to have a worse impact. So it's all around collaboration, working with them, and building a relationship. Okay, the last slide for me is around the risk triage process, and I mentioned this earlier around risk professionals having the ability to do this piece of work. And this doesn't need to be a complicated piece of work. This is actually pretty simple to do. So the left-hand side, you'll see you've got your customers, suppliers, employees. So for example, you have 100 suppliers. Let's risk assess those suppliers according to country, volumes, and products. So we know we have 10 suppliers from Thailand, we have 10 from China, and we have 80 from Australia, or just say 30 from Singapore. Then, once you do your risk assessment rating, keeping in consideration the products, the countries, the volumes of turnover, you should be able to risk assess those suppliers as high, medium, and low. So your Australian suppliers could be low risk, your Singapore company could be medium risk, and Thailand and China could be high risk. So what do you do with that? What do you do with that information? Well, on the high risk, you may have 20 companies. We'll send out questionnaires. There's plenty of questionnaires in the public domain that you can use. Very, very easy to write up a questionnaire. So send those questionnaires to those 20 suppliers. Screen those 20 suppliers maybe once a week or every 2 or 3 days or 24/7. So if company ABC in China you've identified as high risk, then screen that company for adverse media every day or every second day or once a week. That helps you identify. What this does is it helps you identify where your risk sits, and it demonstrates that you know where that risk sits, and then you can obviously have controls and measures in place to manage and mitigate that risk. So that's how it works in practice. Now, there's no need to overcomplicate it, but you can't do the risk assessment without understanding the underlying risks from the country, products or volumes. You then do the risk assessment. You then put appropriate controls and systems in place to obviously mitigate that risk. So, for example, you might go to Thailand and train those 10 suppliers in Thailand. You may arrange an on-site audit by a supplier in Thailand to do that. You may incorporate T's and C's within those contracts. You may just screen those. You may do independent audits. You may just send questionnaires. So there's many different measures, controls that you can apply to support your risk assessment. That's the end of my presentation, and I apologise. I did whiz through towards the end, conscious that there's probably a number of questions that need to address, and I did want to talk about the practical aspects as well. Troy?
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Just got a couple more questions here that have come through. Is a risk-based approach accepted when assessing suppliers during their onboarding, or any single one of them must be assessed from a modern slavery perspective?
When you say must be assessed, in an ideal world, yes. So, I mean, obviously the best way to do this is there's two ways to tackle this. You obviously have existing suppliers, which you can put through a screen. You know, you can screen all those immediately and then look at the output. Onboarding is obviously the key control to obviously prevent that going forward. So, yes, you can apply a risk-based approach at onboarding. And the way you would do that is obviously exactly on the country, on the volume. If it's a very large supplier, then you would do a risk assessment. If it's a supplier that's Australian-based, it's just down the road, it's a small supplier, there's no adverse media, then you wouldn't do a lot of work on that. So the sort of things you'd be looking at would be incorporating terms and conditions within the new contract. You may just put them through an adverse media tool to see if there's anything adverse on there. And that's probably as far as you want to go. Where if you have a new supplier in China, you do exactly that, but you may want to dig down to the directors and who actually owns the company, which goes into the whole, know your customer business. So who are the shareholders? Are the shareholders, do they have a good reputation in the market? Who are the directors? Have the directors been, have there been any enforcement against those directors previously? So you can definitely apply a risk-based approach. And the whole risk assessment is around the risk-based approach.
Okay, Julian. One other question here. Is there a public information database that lists vendors at risk across the world?
I don't believe so. It's a good question. I don't believe so, because I reckon there'd be some legal implications with that, unlike sanctions, where obviously if they're sanctioned, they're sanctioned. I'd say that, and that's probably why I refer to adverse media, because if there's any adverse media on those companies, it'll be probably identified through the newspapers, but I don't think there is a database, a comprehensive database globally that you can tap into. You maybe have to tap into individual databases from CSRs in terms of corporate social responsibility to give you an indication. But modern slavery is still relatively new, and there's obviously legal implications as well. I can look into that for you, but I'm not aware of it. So, for example, at the moment, I would rely on WorldCheck. I'd put company ABC through WorldCheck, look at the adverse media tool in WorldCheck. I'd specifically look for things associated with slavery, child exploitation, human trafficking, and name searches specifically for that target. I'm not saying anything will come up, but at least you've got a control in place. But that's not to say that these databases will not grow in time, because I think they will. And it's exactly to that point, if you're not complying with this Act, then obviously the NGOs will name and shame you, and the government will name and shame you within the public databases in your respective country. So if you don't do a statement, and an NGL, the government or whatever, goes onto their website to have a look at company ABC statement and there's no statement on there, it'll basically say the company has not complied.
Okay, great. Well, look, that's wrapped up the hour. There were a couple more questions there, but if you, Julian might go to the last screen there, which gives his details. And if you guys want to, or attendees want to reach out to Julian directly, feel free to. Obviously, if you want to reach out to me or a Satori group to find out more information about how we can help provide solutions around financial crime, please do so. But on behalf of Satori and also Julian, thanks so much for your time and for all your questions and input. And we'll speak to you next time. Thanks, Julian. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Bye.